Out of the Mothballs, a cautionary tale with pictures. My name is Arthur Wensinger, and I am Emeritus Professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And I'm sitting here in Fisk Hall, where I've had an office for exactly 50 years this week. This presentation is about ruin and reconstruction. Specifically, it is about places that I saw in Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War, and what the same places are like today. Even more specifically, it is about Germany in 1948 and Munich 58 years later, in the years 2004 and 5. The presentation is based on snapshots that I took in those years and on a collection of what are known as visual aids, papers and pictures, clippings and ephemera, which I admit to being an inveterate pack rat, have accumulated over the years and then, metaphorically speaking, laid them up in mothballs. I unpacked it all last year. So what is the point in this day and age of such an earnest and glum endeavor? It's very hard to give any single answer to that, but here are two possibilities. We could say that it is meant to be little more than an exercise in private biography, and assume that younger people today might find it entertaining, possibly even edifying, to follow part of the long past history of an older person. We could say just for the hell of it. Alternatively, we could say that this little story has a more general application and that it might function as an admonition to those who have not been witness to cities in ruin, places where a great many human beings died painfully and bitterly. And there's a lesson in that too, both distressing and salutary. We can reason and rationalize historically, philosophically, religiously, all we want, but two basic facts remain. One, Germany in the first half of the 20th century was the ambitious author of a criminal machine almost beyond imagining. And second, Germany, the country itself, became in the air war from 1942 through the spring of 1945, and later in the mass flight from the Soviet East, one of the vastest killing fields and rubble heaps of modern history. Does that mean then that the point here is to relish retribution, or that in hindsight time heals all wounds? No. Neither of those is my point. My point is simple. I hope only that an audience will look at and think about my snapshot of 20th century ruin and decide yet again, as of course it always does and always will, to put its money on sanity, on diplomacy, on reconstruction, especially now as the world's powers seem determined to go on skating on moral thin ice. Warfare, demolition, and the death of innocents are givens, and I think that they will always be with us. But that is no reason not to try to backpedal as hard as we can. My own biography is, perforce, a big part of what follows, but I do not intend that it dominate. It is that second answer above, the admonitory bit, that underlies the genesis of this enterprise. On the other hand, we can't wish to escape the entertainment factor entirely, and so all is not gloom and doom in what follows. Again, the title of our presentation is Out of the Mothballs. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. This first line of the go-between L.P. Hartley's splendid novel, is much quoted, although its source is easily forgotten. No matter. It occurred to me in beginning to outline this account of half a year of my life nearly 6 decades ago. Even though Hartley's oracular sentiment does not exactly fit the present occasion, I couldn't get it out of my head in my attempt to launch the recollection of that half year. Memory, especially when channeled by one's photograph albums and old coils of film negatives, can be slipshod and blinkered. Old snapshots are mired in misrememberings and covered with dust. I find that when one tries to organize a task at hand, it can be the things most recently seen or read or heard that impinge and adhere. One exploits and shapes them in order to fructify the endeavor. In this case, for instance, a recent New York Times review of a celebrated journalist's autobiography, secondly, an article in Vanity Fair about a photo historian and photographer's upcoming exhibition, and thirdly, an editorial in Time magazine about the centrality of the year 1948. These 3 chance encounters illustrate the point I make. That is, these 3 random snippets clicked for me. They could easily have been any other 3. The Times review begins with a Hartley line about the past being a foreign country, and it struck me at once as being the very line I was trying to recall. It is, I think, a true statement. Who were we really back then in that nexus that we call the past? Can we possibly know or accurately reconstruct? The Vanity Fair article quotes the photographer as saying, "When I walk around now in my apple orchard, I can see what's changed. As you get older, you're not so much interested in seeing things for the first time, but in seeing how they have changed." That is quite like what occurred to me about the city I took snapshots of 57 and 58 years ago, and again in 2004. Dusty coils of 1948 negatives stuffed into little metal screw-top cylinders. I decided last year to re-photograph the same places. And finally, Time magazine's man, who has just written a book about 1948, calls it in an editorial the year that changed everything. He makes a list of some big events of that year and indulges in the game of what if. What if LBJ had lost that first Texas election? What if there had been no Alger Hiss case for Nixon? What if JFK and his family had been more forthcoming about his chronic illnesses and his proclivities? On a far more modest scale, what if I hadn't been where I was in the fall of 1947 and met a man at Dartmouth called Donald Watt? What if I hadn't gone off to Germany the following spring upon graduation from college? The account that follows, with its pictures, is altogether personal. It is autobiographical. It does not pretend to be broadly historical, to be analytical, to draw mighty conclusions, to address questions of right and wrong, to mete out blame for the calamities of our age. In attempting to skirt all that, however, I am perforce plunged right into its midst. What can our 6-month venture long ago possibly have to do with shaping history? Nothing that I can fathom. And yet, the fall of a sparrow and all that, that was us, the sparrows, the grains of sand. An early version of this presentation came about in this way. A young friend of mine who teaches at a private school in Manhattan was speaking with his students a year and a half ago about the September 2001 attack on the World Trade Center. The students, were wondering seriously if this perhaps will come to be known as the worst event in recent history. He thought this needed some perspective, even in our own historical terms. And he spoke to them about last century's world wars, what they subsequently unleashed, the slaughters, the upheavals, the horrific machinery of modern war, and civilian as well as ethnic extermination. He wondered aloud what history, what moral philosophy they had been taught at their school there in Manhattan. Not much, as it turned out. Were they interested? Did they care in this? Well, of course they did. Yet there was so much that they really didn't know yet. Might they be interested in seeing some old photos of a country obliterated by war, taken a few years after 1945 by someone he knew, a former teacher of his, just to see something bigger, perhaps even more dreadful than downtown Manhattan? Which, of course, they did know firsthand. Some of them were familiar with people who died there, and two of them were distantly related to victims. Then they could talk about how things fade into history, into the past, about how long it takes before all that doesn't really matter anymore. Okay, sure they'd like to see. Why not? Joe, the teacher, had seen some of the old 1948 snapshots I took, mostly in Munich. So would I please pull together a little talk? Just photos and descriptions, no propaganda. It might, however, serve to good purpose. So I did that for a student assembly in April 2004 in downtown Manhattan, and I think it had its effect. Some students came around afterwards and wondered, having seen the mess I showed them, and if they hadn't themselves been to Munich, young people travel so much nowadays, they wondered what it looks like today, after the mess was straightened up. It happened that I had to go to Germany that summer, just a couple of months later, for other reasons, and so I took the opportunity, with the help of Harry Bert, a German friend of mine who lives in Munich and whom you will see a lot of, I took the opportunity of trying to stand where I stood 57, 58 years earlier and take some now pictures. I can tell you it was not what's known as a piece of cake. It was hard. In fact, I had to return 4 months later, in October anyhow, for a meeting in Austria, so I filled in a few gaps in this pictorial account. 1948, some perspective. Here are a few of the events of that year, quite quickly. Gandhi is assassinated in India. Tito breaks with Stalin. The U.S. supports military dictatorship in Greece and aids Somoza in the takeover of Nicaragua. The U.S. continues to reassess Russia, a former ally. A chilly, undeclared war turns colder. Truman declares the country's first peacetime draft. Israel as a nation is founded, and the Arabs attack. On a lighter note, Orwell wrote a novel and switched its title from 1948 to 1984. Not that that's exactly a lighter note. Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the American Male, and perhaps by way of illustration, Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire, won its Pulitzer Prize. Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead was published. The first McDonald's drive-in opened in California. Chrysler brought us disc brakes. Ed Sullivan began his broadcasts in the infancy of big television. RCA made a 16-inch television tube. NBC and CBS began evening quarter-hour news broadcasts. Edwin Land's Polaroid camera gave us almost instant photography. Auden got his Pulitzer Prize for The Age of Anxiety, and Wyeth painted Christina's World. Cole Porter staged Kiss Me Kate. Evelyn Waugh made mincemeat out of the funeral industry. Levittown, Long Island was inaugurated, and even if it didn't mean to, we got suburban sprawl. Closer to my subject, this major event. The Soviets blockade Berlin on June 24th. We were already in Germany. The Western Allies begin the airlift to the city 2 days later. The blockade is lifted the following May. The Federal Republic of Germany is established 11 days later, but the airlift continues until the end of September 1949. 1948 was, it turns out, a pretty fateful year for most of the globe. But we students, were we aware then that we were, or could have been, with a bit more awareness, living through a time of earth-shaking events? Certainly not. I, for one, was an innocent voyager when our little group left Windsor Locks, Connecticut, and arrived some days later in June on our charitable mission to Munich. I remained there until midwinter 48, by which time some real awareness had crept over me and my cohorts. Why was I, a freshly baked college grad, so involved with Germany? Of things German, I had only my family name and a few years of beginning to learn the language in high school. Neither my father, nor his father or mother, nor probably even their families spoke the language. My parental forebears had emigrated from Germany and Switzerland in the early 19th century to Ohio, and assimilation was rapid there. My mother's father's family were 17th century settlers and incorporators of Stonington, Connecticut, so there was no German there. But wait a moment, there is a connection. My maternal grandfather, Arthur Stevens, married a Scotswoman from Edinburgh. 2 of her cousins had been killed in World War I. She disliked Germany and anything German. On European travels in the early 20s, she tried a few nights in Berlin. It didn't work out. She packed up and fled, probably in high dudgeon. Her 2 eldest daughters had married men with acceptable names, Mather and Buchanan. Her youngest, my mother, became engaged to a man with a more problematical name and family background, even though it did go back a good century and more. But they were married. I came along as the first child, and she, my grandmother, a little more than teasingly, nicknamed me Jerry, which in those days meant German. The Jerrys were the Germans in the First World War. Happily, she eventually learned to treasure my father, probably in fact above the other sons-in-law, but that's an entirely different story. So there you are, nomen est omen. Your name is a sign of the future. In high school in Michigan, I began to learn the language, as I said. I liked the sounds of the language, and there was a kind of magic in being able to say something in a different way that your other friends couldn't understand. I transferred to a boarding school in Massachusetts, where I elected 3 more semesters of German with a demanding and charming and rather enigmatic man named Dirk Hugo van der Stocken. He had been my summer school dorm master in Paul Revere Hall. A section of his final examination in my senior year was on the morning of June 6th, 1944. A date that must mean something to you. A section of his final examination was a translation exercise of a news bulletin that he had received in the middle of the night before the exam on his shortwave radio. It was a first account. In German, was it? Or had he translated it then into German? Anyhow, it was a report of the Normandy landing. We had to translate it. This oddity has stuck with me for 61 years. How did he know about it? If rumor and recollection are correct, Dirk Hugo soon thereafter left the school and was said, or rumored, all along to have been an OSS man. Whatever. That is a formative fragment in my genesis as a Germanist. I did not go into the army upon graduation, as I had vaguely intended to. Instead, I went directly to college. There I majored in 2 fields, biology, botany, and German. German won out. The department staff impressed me. Cowden, Sensenik, Scott, Schlossmacher, and Ryder, the last 2 so different from each other except in their infectious enthusiasms. Schlossmacher persuaded me to preside over the German club for, I think, 2.5 years. I wrote my senior thesis with Frank Ryder. So from 1944 to 1948, I got my first real impressions of the glory of German literature. I think that Rilke and Hofmannsthal and Kafka and Mann were in themselves enough to propel me toward and through graduate school at Ann Arbor. And the rest is my own history. In 1955, I took a job teaching German language and literature at Wesleyan University and continued there for about 40 years. I'm retired now, but still have my office here. It had been in Dartmouth Hall in the fall of 1947 that we were visited by one Donald Watt, founder of the Experiment in International Living of Putney, Vermont. Still going, strong. He was recruiting college students to join up for the first groups to go to Germany after World War II. The mission I signed up for was to help rebuild a bombed-out women's dormitory at the University of Munich. A second smaller group was going to go to Stuttgart. In the Munich group, we were about a dozen boys. Not quite, I think. College men then were still often called boys. So the idea of such a venture was irresistible. How did we young Americans who had not served in the military in Europe, all but one of whom had never been abroad, who had never seen firsthand the near obliteration of a country, how did we 19 to 22-year-olds absorb what we saw? I can't speak for the others. For me, it was mostly sheer adventure, and I don't apologize. The war had ended barely 3 years earlier, but from what we saw, it seemed more as if it had only been one or less. What did we know of warfare, of bombardment, of air raids? Certainly we were aware of a number of things that we'd been taught, told, read in papers. We appreciated, presumably, also that the territory of the United States, except during our own Civil War and the consequent devastation of the South, had never experienced the effects of total war in remotely the same way as the Near and Far East, the Slavic world, France, Germany, Spain, the Balkans, the lowlands, parts of Africa, England. We tended to boast then, as now, that America has been blessed in that regard. It's still the proper term, even after 9/11. But back then, did we appreciate that we were looked upon by much of the rest of the world, fairly or not, as fun-loving, materialistic, babes in the wood, arrogant and innocent? By and large, no, we did not. We got to Munich, stood there, looked around, and saw a city, and later much of the rest of the country, in astonishing ruin. We met our German partners, began working with them, and not one of them or anyone else we met, with a few notable exceptions, seemed willing to talk in tangible terms about what they'd been through. Even now, the great majority of the remaining survivors would rather not talk about it or come to terms with what happened there, that is, in its physical dimension. There is still, in both Germany and Japan, principally in the former, an ironic anomaly at work. There remains an ingrained reluctance, a difficulty in accounting in historical, moral, even statistical terms for the wreckage of Germany. This seemingly insurmountable barrier, looming over 2 generations of post-war Germany, has, of course, gradually been acknowledged and increasingly written and talked about, and thus, in small part, dismantled over the ensuing decades. What will probably never be laid to rest, however, is the specter which refuses to be exorcised: the colossal numbers of victims of the machinery of the Holocaust. That singular crime, unique in the annals of modern history, lurks everywhere in the background of this account, but it is not our topic. Our topic is, for the 3rd time, ruin and rejuvenation. One of the amazing things I've experienced in my lifetime is seeing what Germany has done during the past 60 years to restore and expand its physical self in its undeniable and by and large selfless march toward democracy, and in pulling itself up by its bootstraps to become one of the fundamental bastions of what we call freedom and human rights in the Western world. During these 6 decades, it is remarkable how little, until very recently, has been researched and published in Germany about the vast numbers of civilians targeted and killed by the incessant American and British air raids, the blockbuster detonations and firestorms, and at the end of the war, the mass killing and expulsion of Germans from the Soviet East. The numbers, though they are controversial and can never be fully established, are staggering. But it is the Germans themselves who have muffled this with a great blanket of silence until the 1990s. Understandably, the subject has long been called taboo in Germany, although that is not quite the right term. Trauma and guilt may have more to do with it. All my German friends and acquaintances, unless expressly pressed for recollections, were long quiet. When they answered, it was with a touch of irony, perhaps even of wry humor. Times are slowly changing. A few books, some written and published in other countries than Germany, have appeared in recent years. A number of earlier first-hand accounts, some written during or right after the war and largely ignored at the time, have been reissued. Critical studies of autobiographical and fictional accounts of the bombing are appearing now, one after the other. Notable among them, a study by Suzanne Face-Gulani. There are a number of volumes of photographs, one of them creating its own firestorm of controversy, with very grisly pictures indeed. Yet it is safe to say that the German reading public, by and large, still, after so many decades, wants to look the other way. That is, of course, toward the future. This is gradually changing, even among the aging survivors. In the 1990s, the late W.G. Sebald and Hans Magnus Enzensberger, and following their lead in the United States, journalists and novelists and critics like Susan Sontag, although Kurt Vonnegut had written his Slaughterhouse-Five much earlier. These were among the most who initiated interest also in America and in Britain in the work of earlier eyewitness writers. I'll name some: Wolfgang Borchert, Heinrich Böll, Hans Erich Nossack, Gerd Ledig, Alexander Kluge, Walter Kempowski, Dieter Forte, Günther Kunert, Victor Klemperer, and of course Günter Grass, from his earliest fiction to his recent novel Crab Walk. More recent examples, the journalist Volker Hage's books and authors of an excellent series of articles in Spiegel magazine on the air war, the statistical and horrifically illustrated studies by the historian Jörg Friedrich of cities and populations demolished. They continue the list. The work initially was hardly welcomed by German readers. Friedrich's 2 volumes, for instance, have distressed more readers than they have satisfied. Serious historical engagement, though, is on the march. We must hope that revisionism, tendentiousness, and German victimization will not be a large part of the mix and final tally when the definitive work appears. I believe that it certainly will not. As for all of that, having to do World War II, there's still a very long way to go. We're not even anywhere near finished with World War I. What eventuates from the serious historians should instead become an enormous cautionary tale, one that will be a bitter brew, but salutary for the second and third and future generations since the war, not only in Germany, but also in other countries, not the least of them the United States. We must assume, however, an attentive audience. To take one hotly debated example, will it be profitable at this late date to continue to point out the facts and the numbers about the February 1945 bombing raids over the city of Dresden? Friedrich and Sebald et al. Remind us of that appalling statistical mystery. Were there only 30,000 or 40,000 or 60,000 women, children, refugees suffocated or incinerated in the carpet bombing of that city? Were there more civilian victims of the 44 and 45 British and American bombings of Germany than resulted from the American atomic bombs dropped on two Japanese cities? What about the Tokyo firestorms? Were they more productive than those in Hamburg, Berlin, the Ruhr, and hundreds of other German cities and towns? Exact numbers of victims of Allied air raids on Germany are impossible to come by, but they are huge. Was it 600,000? Was it closer to 1 million civilians killed by bombs? Anyhow, killed as they were, it seems only to have prolonged the war. There's almost total agreement on that point. The more cities bombed, the more civilians killed, the longer the war went on. Another 1 million or more Germans, very conservatively, some authorities even say 2 million, refugees from the Soviet East at the very end of the war, after the war was, quote, over. They were maimed, raped, and killed in the immediate aftermath of the so-called armistice. Only the benumbed could wish to engage their minds with these numbers. But as Stalin has famously told us, the death of one person can be a tragedy. The murder of 1 million is only a statistic. Let me say again, it bears repeating, my role in post-war Germany was infinitesimal. So to speak, I was no more than a camera, to use Christopher Isherwood's metaphor, and a very amateur camera at that. When our little group arrived in Munich, it was the evening of a day at the beginning of June 1948. We emerged from the train from Geneva via Zurich into the dank ruins of what had been Munich's central station, most of its roof and walls still missing. Repairs were being made 24 hours a day. We walked through the streets where an occasional ancient trolley car threaded its way. The streets themselves, after 2.5 years, were fairly well cleared. They were lined on either side by vast piles of rubble, slowly being sorted out and carted away to even vaster mountains of reusable stones and bricks and structural metal. It was an astonishing sight. We wondered, what are these muffled figures doing? Why are they bothering these determined and fastidious Germans? Our fascination was mingled with a sense of something exotic. To be frank, a sort of perverse thrill. Perhaps the residue in us of the excitement that children discover in destruction and wrecking sand castles and watching trees get chopped down. What was it in us, in me anyhow? Was it innocence? Or was it an indication of brute insensitivity? I, at least, was far too uneducated then to rationalize, to think that this is what they deserved and what they got. An eye for an eye, payback for Hitler, and the final solution. It's not what I was thinking then. Be that as it may, we had gone over there with nothing in the way of the experience of war, and were not yet alert to the fact that a good while after the detonations and firestorms, there was still an occasional unexploded bomb discovered, and on 1 or 2 occasions, a body found still buried beneath the rubble. Even here in Munich, one of the relatively less devastated cities in Germany, perhaps only, let us say, 2/5 destroyed, and only 6,000 to 7,000 civilians who were victims of the bombing dead. Part of this excitement lay in the novelty of the fact that our group was the only group of United States civilians allowed into the American zone at the time. And here was this unfathomable mess. Where were we going to live? Here were our German student counterparts. What were they like? Was the city still filled with unrepentant Nazi survivors? What was going on? I have only one photo taken on the grounds of the Experiment in International Living in the spring of 1948. It shows part of the group walking on a Vermont hill near Putney and getting to know one another before leaving the next day for Bradley Field in Connecticut. Here are the German groups getting ready to board a rather questionable propeller plane of the Transocean Airline, a firm that, needless to say, no longer exists. We were trapped at Bradley Field in Windsor Locks for a day and a night. The arrival of the charter plane was delayed because it had been carrying immigrants from South America and had first to land and be fumigated. So we stayed overnight in Connecticut. The takeoff was a bit touchy because of excess weight, as we were told. All the boys had to go to the front of the cabin to balance the aircraft. Not very reassuring. We headed for Gander, Newfoundland, where we refueled and took off for Shannon, Ireland. Here's a photo of our friend Jack Lentz, leader, or co-leader actually, of the Stuttgart group at the Shannon airport. When we had descended from the plane there in Ireland, the wind caught the rear exit door and pulled it off its top hinge. Another reassuring moment. That had to be dealt with, of course, and that consumed another 2 days and 2 nights. We stayed in crew member cabins at the airport. The first day of our layover, they arranged for us a singularly depressing tour of Limerick and surroundings. Finally, we were allowed back on the plane, took off for Geneva. An additional overnight was spent there. Next day, we boarded a Swiss train for Zurich, rode to the border, and switched into a rickety German train. Spent at least an hour and a half at customs on the border, where Swiss authorities dealt with pathetic chocolate smugglers. And finally, we arrived in Munich in the evening. Each of us had been assigned to a prearranged German partner, with whom we had briefly corresponded, and whom we met at the station. We stayed a few days in rooms in the part of the women's dormitory that had survived the bombs. Then each pair headed for a week to the home of his partner's family. My partner, was a lad named Hermann Leip. He had dropped the fun. The youngest son of one of the German army's few field marshals, who was in his 3rd year of Allied detention at Nuremberg. There, Feldmarschall General Wilhelm Ritter von Leip was to remain until the following year, even though he had been exonerated at his trial earlier. Before the war, the Schrott von Leip family had owned one of the grand villas in the village of Hohenschwangau in the Bavarian Alps, right at the Austrian border. That villa had been requisitioned by the U.S. Army, and an American captain had moved in. Frau von Leip and Hermann were resettled in 2 rooms on the top floor of a house in the village. Hermann's older brother had been killed on the Russian front. His younger brother came home for many years in Soviet POW camps, but soon died in a motorcycle accident. The old field marshal returned home, built a fine new house there. He died in 1956, his wife 3 years later in a fall during her weekly mountain climb in the Alps. Hermann married and is now a widower, sole occupant of the house, but there is a new generation of Leibs, son and grandson. As we say, das Leben geht weiter. Here is the view from my attic room in Hohenschwangau, looking toward the Austrian border. This is the Alpsee in Hohenschwangau looking north. We see at the right the renowned, if overblown, castle of Neuschwanstein, which was built by the famously mad King Ludwig, where he housed, among other luminaries, Richard Wagner. Walt Disney, as you may know, managed to make an even kitschier copy of this castle for America's delectation. The original is now the most frequently sought-out tourist attraction in all of Germany. Coming from the Midwest, I had had little opportunity to do any mountain climbing. At Dartmouth, I scrambled up several of the elevations in the White Mountains, different in Germany. All the von Leib family were inveterate climbers, and it was part of my obligation, and also by way of a challenge to the Yankee I was assumed to be, that Hermann, with no explanation or apology, got me up and safely down several of the rugged mountains in the area. Here is one of them, of the name of Pilgerschrofen, or, you remember what I said about memory in the past, it could be a mountain called the Säuling. We go up and then look down at the Alpsee. A giddy experience. Here is your obedient servant at the top of that mountain, or perhaps another one of the half-dozen we climbed, this time with ropes and more advanced climbing gear. Here is another view of me some months later. That is either a benign or a hopeful look I seem to be giving. How does one know? Can one recall? We returned to Munich the same way we got there, in an ancient train so full that we had to ride for over 2 hours, standing outside on its running boards and clutching handrails. It's a process which was known as Trittbrettfahren. In any case, we began working in earnest on the Maria Antonia house on the Kaulbachstrasse, very near the university, that is to say, very near the ruins of the university. Here is a snapshot taken from the top of the still standing wall of that dormitory, with a view into the interior of what happened to countless buildings in Munich after the incendiary bombs burned out their guts. How odd it seemed that the chimneys still stood. Many did come through the war, but some of these were the first things to be rebuilt. And why? Because people were living in what remained of the ground floors, or more likely in the cellars, and they had to keep warm in the fierce winters following the war. The Allied Bomber Command made no bones about it. Civilian dwellings were targets. The will of the enemy, they thought, would be broken. But it was not. Here's part of our gang. The piles of bricks in the foreground are not our handiwork. We didn't make them. We collected and we scraped them for reuse. Several of the people there are professional masons. The man in the foreground is Professor Wolfgang Müller, an Egyptologist. Indeed, he was one of the most renowned Egyptologists. But of course, here he is doing his bit. Everyone was. This mess had to be dealt with. Hermann dismantles an unsafe wall. That is Hermann's ubiquitous hat on his head. And he seems also to have saved his sunglasses through the war. Across the Kaulbachstrasse, the houses have been partially reconstructed. Some co-workers are taking a break from the job. We have Bill from New Jersey. He became a very close friend of mine, remained one until the end of his life 3 years ago. Later in life, Bill was a classical historian and author. Next to him is Hans from Augsburg. Until his retirement, Hans was a member of the directorate of the DAV, the Deutsche Aluminiumgesellschaft, that is the aluminum company of Germany. and there's Georg Seebauer, his father. In the Third Reich, he had been head of all electric power companies in southern Germany. Our group attended his denazification trial, at which he was exonerated because of his work against the party later in the war, particularly for countermanding Hitler's personal decree to destroy the entire German infrastructure. But it was a close call for Herr Seebauer. Heinz Münzinger, who was before the war an exchange student in the U.S., was the German liaison for our group. The Münzinger sports store in the Munich Rathaus, the city hall, still thrives as the premier sports emporium of Bavaria. Justin, one of our group, then Hermann, as one can tell by his hat, we called it der verdammte Hut, and Hans, they're taking a rest from dismantling another of the perilous dormitory walls. One by one, the bricks were slid down the chute on the right, and as the bricks landed below and were scraped clean, we passed them along. From me in the beret to Gustl Weber, administrator of the Hill School and leader of the American group, passed on to Bill, then to Hans, then to Roger. Note my L.L. Bean moccasins. I'm the American there. Up the bricks were passed to the masons constructing a new wall. We worked like this for the better part of 2 months, with weekend breaks, to return, if we wished, to our German families. The whole thing was certainly good exercise. The wall goes up. This was our mess hall, so to speak, in the cellar of the dorm. Some sort of festive occasion seems to be going on. Why else do some of us have white shirts and jackets on? Hans enters with his Kartoffelknödel, swimming in a puddle of what is probably the dish made of chopped beef lungs called Boischal. To this day, I still order it when I'm in Munich. It's really an excellent food. Wirsing, a kind of chopped and creamed curly kale, was another favorite specialty. The menu then was restricted, but mostly healthful and hearty, no longer what it was before the currency reform. I found in my envelope of ephemera a menu from the sweet little restaurant Hopfenperle on the Kaulbachstrasse. It is from November 1948. Nothing on it costs the equivalent of more than 75 cents for full meal. Soup was less than a dime. Far more elegant, but not much more expensive, oddly enough, is the menu from the Spiegelsaal restaurant in what was miraculously not destroyed of the Bayerischer Hof Hotel. This menu was dated, as you see, 10 days later. The fanciest selection on the menu, the Chateaubriand, cost about $2.50. The dollar was king then, and remained so from 1950 through 1954, when I returned to study in Munich. That is, I studied there those 4 years. Our pay envelopes, yes, we were employees of a building firm, a few marks a week, is being doled out here by Dr. Müller. Why I am wearing a tie, I don't know. The money wasn't much, but it was the first real German money. The Währungsreform, or currency reform, had been declared in June, while we were there, by the banks and the American occupation authorities, 1 new mark for 10 old ones. This resulted in an exchange rate of 4.25 marks to the dollar, a rate that lasted for years, an almost criminal boon to those with greenbacks in their pockets. Happy hour in the cellar. How were we civilian American students made legitimate? in the United States zone of occupation. German bureaucracy, through feast and famine, never sleeps. We had to be documented. Among the scraps I have saved are these: permission to live, permission to work, permission to travel out of town and back, from one zone to the other, permission to get paid in German marks, permission to qualify for rationing coupons, for bread, sugar, meat, fat, soap, tobacco, on and on. Hans and Bill on the roof. Here are a few press photos of us celebrities for publicity and propaganda. Note how well the Amis, that's what they called us, the Americans, and the Krauts used them. The Germans, note how well they get along together. Here, upon a reconstructed arrival in the dormitory, I seem not altogether sanguine about climbing those rickety stairs. The Munich papers were appropriately fascinated by us. We were probably treated too indulgently. One wonders what was really said about us. We were taken on a press walk through the city. Here are 3 professional shots. This one shows 4 of us studying a Litfaßsäule, a kiosk. Culture has returned to Munich. Theater, films, opera. Here are Hans, myself, Justin, and Heribert kneeling. In the background is the Theatinerkirche, the great Baroque church of the Theatrine monks, whose twin towers were more or less spared, but whose interior repair has only in the past year been completed. At left in the background is the Feldherrnhalle, the Field Marshal's Loggia, an enlarged replica of the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence. It became a Nazi shrine to the heroically fallen thugs under Hitler. At this spot, the populace was expected to give the Hitler salute. To avoid that, one would cross through the alley behind it, the so-called Druckeberger Gasse. Here we sit on one of the partially reconstructed ruins of the pair of fountains on either side of the Ludwigstrasse. The main complex of the university is in the background. Large lecture classes were held in auditoriums without roofs. After the experiment months were over, 3 of us stayed on for several more months and we enrolled at the university. The Theatinerkirche closer up. In the right background are the remains of the Odeon. By 1950, when I returned for a year of graduate study, the building to the right of the church was already the main showroom of the Mercedes-Benz firm. Today, the complex behind it is the center of one of the most splendid and costly shopping areas in Europe. In early August, we took an automobile tour through parts of the American, French, and British zones. We went west and north via Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Mainz, many other crippled cities, to Bremen and Hamburg. Passing through Hanover, I snapped at random the ruins of what had been the city center. The next photo, although it looks like the same place, is not at all. It is Hildesheim. Rubble is rubble. When I look at this young woman today, I wonder who she was, who she perhaps is now, if she still lives. It's a little mystery moment. I like the way that she smiles at us. Heidelberg, from the heights of the Palatine Castle. The city was mostly spared for a complex variety of reasons, among them to have an intact center for American operations, and gratuitously, I think, to save a famous university city where certain powerful American and British luminaries had enjoyed the German student life of old. Wine, women, dueling scars, and all. It gives one pause even now. This is part of the old Heidelberg Castle, wrecked by the French many years ago. Picturesque and validated tourist ruins, quite unlike the others. On a later trip, we were driven up to Weinheim on der Bergstrasse, where Hans's family were living. This is the interior of our Schlafwagen, or sleeper van. Ale hangs from the upper bunk, and there's Hans and Bill. Yet another trip, this one by bus, down to the German Alps. Here we stop at a logging camp. We can spot Hermann's hat. The license plate denotes the American zone and shows the year 1948. The town of Oberammergau, home of the famous and infamous Passion Play, which only in recent years has cleaned up its act. These two locals are dressed not in recycled costumes for the tourist, not then. They simply dressed as they did every day. It is perfectly possible that they are Pontius Pilate and Christ, or is it the other way around? We took another long weekend break and went by train to the first performances of the reopened Salzburg Festival in western Austria, very near Germany. Opera, theater, concerts, with many famous names that meant very little to me then. We are here about to get on the train at the main station in Munich. There's the hat again. In the foreground are Mickey Selig, Heribert, Hans. Mickey was in the Stuttgart group, but she came with us on this venture. She stayed on in Germany with Bill and me, just we three Americans. She was one of the 3 Jewish American students in the 2 groups, and that is a very interesting chapter in itself. This next batch of pictures has to do with the film that we worked on and helps explain why Bill and Mickey and I stayed on in Munich. At the farewell dinner for the experiment group in the Bayerischer Hof Hotel, there happened to be at another table 4 or 5 film producers and a director and a famous actor named Fritz Kortner. They were looking for young American students to work on and act in a movie about the return of a German Jewish university professor who had been invited back from exile in California after the war to lecture at a university. The story centers principally on latent resurgence of anti-Semitism in post-war Germany. The film was a German-American co-production and was to be shot in both languages. My task was to be translator of the script, interpreter, and an occasional extra to start a progress, swell a scene or two. Not that I felt myself to be particularly Prufrockian. Bill was given a secondary starring role, much bigger than mine. An American actress had already been signed up together with another unaffiliated American. This shot, for example, shows the director's idea of a California bungalow near the Los Angeles University where the story begins. Do note the palmettos, the oleander, and their idea of Californian domestic architecture. This chance encounter in the hotel, it was really Bill they were looking for, truly changed the course of our lives. It began in the Spiegelsaal restaurant of the hotel. We had gotten to know the owner of the hotel, one Falk Volkart, and he kindly suggested that we be his guests for a few nights until we could find digs for ourselves, for as long as the movie took to make. Looking at a photo of the hotel right after the war, one wonders where he planned to find beds for us. In fact, the rear of the hotel, where the restaurant was relatively undamaged. And here is what the main facade looks like today. It is a renowned and quite elegant hostelry. The professor in the story, played by the famous actor Fritz Kortner, who also happened to write the script, stands in this picture, and Elliot, played by Bill, sits with his ever-present cigarette. It wasn't unusual. The truth is that we all smoked, almost all the time, especially Bill, unfortunately. The film production and all that went with it made a momentary splash in German newspapers and magazines. Here are some examples of our ephemeral notoriety. By this time, of course, all the other experimenters had to return to the U.S. We could not stay on indefinitely as guests at the hotel, and so we had to find a more permanent place to live. Here we're being picked up by the studio car early in the morning, or in the evening perhaps, hard to tell, to go down to Munich's film center at Geiselgasteig. Because of electricity rationing, they filmed either from 6:30 or so in the morning, or began in the evening and worked through most of the night. In the background is the principal northern city gate, the Siegestor, or the Victory Arch. Beyond it, to the south, is the university. Because we had late mornings to early evenings to ourselves, we had time to enroll at the university as foreign students. And here is the home we found, held up by posts and poles. One of the last air raid bombs to fall on Munich removed the core of this building, but enough was left over for Pension Irma to continue in business. 5 of us moved in then. Bill and Hans shared a room, Heribert and I another, and Mickey had her own. It was a very congenial nest for a few months. In the film, there's a confrontation between the American and sympathetic German students against the antagonistic Germans at the university. The leader of the neo-Nazi group tries here to face down the heroic Americans and the Jewish professor. The lead American woman was played by Rosemary Murphy, the daughter of Ambassador Robert Murphy. He was one of the most important post-war U.S. negotiators and diplomats. Rosemary went on to a big career in New York theater and played a number of Hollywood roles. Here is one of the ensuing tussles. The photographer, you notice, caught the mic boom. Here I confer with Josef von Baki, the director, and Rosemary. Take 3. Another of the American students in the film here, Mike Murphy, no relation to Rosemary, together with Bill. I have another 100 pictures or so of our working on the film, but we haven't the time and you haven't the patience to look at all of these. So, instead, back to downtown Munich. After the experiment summer, we who stayed on were much more on our own, and we had to provide for ourselves. Well, where do we get the essentials? Chocolate, coffee, soap, toilet paper, cigarettes. We, handful of civilians, presented a bit of a challenge to the occupying American forces in Munich. We found a great deal of help. They gave us PX privileges. The centrally located Army Post Exchange was where everything was all but free. And in addition, it was the ultimate source for a lot of black market bartering. In the PX, a carton of cigarettes cost 60 cents. A box of Hershey bars, 24 of them, I guess, about the same, not even $1. Coffee was a nickel a pound, and so on. All you needed were dollars, and we had them in abundance, thanks in great part to the generous film contracts. We were paid in the new marks converted into dollars. My contract shows that from August 19 to December 31, I was to receive almost 5,000 D-mark. Bill, as a star, made a lot more. These really were outrageous sums for the time, so Bill and I easily paid for most of everything. Intelligence and prudence would have dictated that we buy a parcel of downtown Munich property that was offered to us for a couple of thousand marks, but of course we didn't. If we had, we'd be sitting pretty for many years, owning some of the world's most valuable property. Alas, we had neither the taste, nor the talent, nor the interest for real estate speculation. This is the PX in the background, and this is the view from its entrance looking out. And there is Prince Elector Maximilian I remounted on his pedestal. And here, seated on his pedestal, is Maximilian, King of Bavaria, before the burnt-out hulk of the Residenz, his Munich palace, on the left, and the Nationaltheater, the opera, on the right. What did the rest of Munich's core look like? Remember that this is now 3 years since the cessation of hostilities. They're still mopping up the streets and still clearing the rubble. We've seen already that all major German cities were in indescribable ruin, and most of the towns too. Yet vibrant life was everywhere. We have in this batch photos of only one of the cities. Munich, relatively speaking, was one of the least disastrous places, which is to say, only a third to a half demolished. By contrast, the entire Ruhr Basin, together with the historic core and the industrial areas of the cities of Mainz, Frankfurt, Hannover, Cologne, Darmstadt, Mannheim, Stuttgart, Chemnitz, Leipzig, Kassel, Hamburg, Bremen, Berlin, Dresden, Pforzheim, Nuremberg, and on and on. They all seemed erased from the face of the earth. Here, with little comment, are snapshots made in the summer and fall of 1948 in Munich. The first photo shows one of the many portals of the vast palace of the Maxburg. Nothing of it remains except one of these gateways, now incorporated into a new commercial block of buildings, as we'll see later. Downtown business blocks like this one, next to the City Hall, and the Frauenkirche, were irrecoverable and had been partly cleared away, mostly by hand. Here are spectators of a cheerful autumn parade. There are plenty of perches available to them. Here is another view of the same event. Note an almost resurrected building in the background. Bikes, cars, and trucks on the move. One can see that progress is about to be made here. From the sign, it reads, "Caution, construction area." Here is a part of the arcades in the royal courtyard, the Hofgarten. At the corner of the Prinzregentenstrasse, near the Haus der Kunst, stand the remains of the one-time Prinzregenten Café, now entirely gone. Scrap metal was recovered, piled up, picked over, and ready for reuse, as are the bricks and building stones. This is a typical Schuttberg, or rubble heap. One of the biggest ones was built in the northern part of the city and eventually became the center for the Munich Olympic Games, which in part is a long and tragic story. The strange onion domes of the twin towers of the Frauenkirche, Munich's vast cathedral. It mostly survived, but the surrounding buildings were less fortunate. The slender neo-Gothic spires of the City Hall sustained relatively little damage, but not the nearby business and residential structures. The apartments in the background were luckier than those in the foreground. In a couple of years after this photo of Neptune's Café, it was back in business, but looking quite different, as we shall later see. The man here is digging out, scraping, piling up bricks and stones for future use. A view along the Prinzregentenstrasse. Women are shopping after the currency reform, when stores were restocked. Munich's tallest building, ambitiously dubbed the Wolkenkratzer, or skyscraper, made it through mostly unscathed. We can already see overhead electric streetcar cables. Trolley lines were quickly reestablished all over town, and they remained the principal public transport until the construction years later of a wonderful subway system. Improvised shelters grew up in the rubble for both stores and homes. This is a view of Die Sonnenstrasse. Ironically, that means Sunshine Street. An ambulance, a mother and child on a bike, a small car, and trees in leaf. Every salvageable scrap was recycled. These are the so-called Schuttleute, or rubble people. They were mostly women, some children, and old men. A notable proportion of the younger men were dead, or still in Russian prison camps, or without arms or legs. That's a vivid image I still carry with me. Wherever one looked on the streets, there was always a man on crutches, or in a self-propelled cart, or in a push wagon. Amputees were a dime a dozen, and that's the way they felt about it themselves. Here's the same street from another angle. Today the elegant shops are back, but in this scene, not quite yet. Reinforcement. A glimpse across the street from the Marie Antonia house where we worked. That, one recalls, was the initial reason for this journey. I conclude this segment on ruin before we get to the topic of reconstruction. Here, on a happier note, are Hans and Mickey on one of our more pleasant trips, halfway up the spire of the Ulm Cathedral, which incidentally is the tallest church spire in the world. At least it was then, and probably still is today. Hans waits for his date, who was probably Mickey, with a bouquet and a copy of Time magazine. Could even have been the one that reported that Truman had defeated Dewey for the presidency in November of 1948, which of course was true. I, however, still retain a piece of real ephemera, the issue of the Münchener Merkur newspaper, whose headline reports that it was Dewey over Truman. They had picked that up from the infamous Chicago Tribune blooper. Finally, two of our friends on a stroll through downtown, Mickey and Heribert. In the 50s, Mickey married, had a child, and died, far too young. Bill taught at the University of California at Berkeley and at Hunter in New York. He split his time between Manhattan and Vermont. He retired early and settled finally by strong preference year-round in Vermont, where he died in 2002. Hans is still very much with us, less involved with running the world of aluminum. He's a rabid golfer, father and grandfather of several, and living with his wife in a splendid house near the Rhine on the outskirts of Cologne. Hermann, who is now more than content in Hohenschwangau, we've already covered him. Heribert became a husband, father, and a big television director and producer in Mainz. He moved many years ago with his family back to Munich, to which beautiful city it was always his goal to return. And indeed, Munich is a beautiful city again. It's the one in which most Germans, if they had the choice, would like to live, according to polls that are taken year after year. It is a smart and expensive place, a European center for art and music and theater. It is also very conservative. It is difficult now to find any traces of wartime devastation, and that's true of practically every place in Germany now, except in parts of what was Eastern Germany. The concept of Europe in ruins is hardly one any longer, at least for the two most recent generations. Yet Germans are certainly aware of why the appalling wreckage came about. In simplest terms, you can't deny that it was payback for 12 years of Nazism, for Warsaw, for Rotterdam, for London, for Eastern Russia, and all the rest. But also, but only laterally, it was payback for the extermination camps. The bitter truth is that genocide, Auschwitz and all of that, was not the reason that Allied revenge was taken, except for some of the bombings during the last few months of the war, and even then only sporadically. It wasn't until the 60s that the genocide became the huge topic that it properly remains. But that's not my topic. My topic, to repeat once again, is the bombing of one city, the reasons for my going there almost 60 years ago, the cleanup, and the reconstruction. I showed this first version of my personal documentary to students, as you know, in New York in April of 2004. Some of them wondered what had become of the places shown in my old photographs, and that is the impetus and background for this final segment. Working with a selection of the pictures you have seen, not all of them, Alan Wilkinson of Wesleyan's Digitization Lab has done a masterful job of blending from the old to the new. Some of the places look nearly identical, either because they were spared in the bombing or because the decision was made to reconstruct with great fidelity the landmark buildings. Sometimes it was only their facades, sometimes it was both the exterior and the interior of these buildings. Some others that we see from the old photographs were entirely demolished and either turned into open spaces or replaced with modern structures. Most of these are uninspired, aesthetically innocuous, and inoffensive buildings. Some of them are downright ugly. But that made little difference to the people in Munich in the early 50s. To the citizens' eye, then, they were beautiful, new, and hopeful. National Socialist abominations were torn down, even if they had survived. They will, we must hope, never be missed, especially the miserable shrines to the Nazis, though one or two have been purposely preserved as an admonition. And in this regard, we must say that the Germans have done a far better job of it than the Japanese and the Italians. Munich as a whole, and is a very large city, not quite 1 million people back in the 30s, was about 1/3 to 2/5 destroyed, and a relatively small number, 6 to 7, no, more like 7 to 8,000 people lost their lives in the bombing. The core of the old city, as opposed to the outskirts, fared far worse. It was hit, all of it. Great parts of it were entirely demolished. That core has been impressively reconstituted over the past half-century. Here is a map of the part of Munich that I knew and still know best. In the 2004 walkabouts, we proceed from the central station to the city center up to Schwabing, the university, the Kaulbachstrasse, where our dormitory is, out to the Englischer Garten, then up the Isar River to the area around the Deutsches Museum. It is, as I say, a very selective tour, and not meant to be a sentimental journey, at least not certainly entirely. Nor is it meant to be one of those sappy old travelogues that we used to see on Saturdays in the movie houses of our youth, which faded out with a phrase such as, "Now reluctantly we must bid farewell to valiant Venezuela." Its ending is more equivocal, and it is meant to be. The question is meant to linger. What is the point of all this? We shall hold that in abeyance after we see the then and now photos. We begin this excursion of Munich, my pictures of 1948 and 2004. And I've divided the city into 4 parts. You'll see in the map. We start with sort of the core of the city, go around to the Bahnhof, the big station, up around to the university and to the place we were working, and the Maria Antonia house in the Kaulbachstrasse. And then we come down the Isar River and end pretty close to where we began. First picture, the ruins in front of the St. Martin's Church on the Isar. Sort of a nondescript, not important church. Very little is known about it, but that will go along very well with our final picture, as you will see. Then, the way it looks today, in a shot closer up, I walked into it, it's very attractive. We move then on up toward the center of the city to see an old photograph of what was known as the Munich skyscraper, that now has the Department of Weights and Measures and the Vermessungsamt and a number of things in it. It survived quite remarkably during the war. The next picture is, ironically, bitterly, on the Sonnenstrasse, which was very badly bombed near the main station, with a lady on a bicycle there with a child, and the way it looks today, a sweep of modern buildings. Clearly everything was gone. The next one is in the Sendlingerstrasse, and it goes up toward a view of the new Rathaus, or City Hall, and the Frauenkirche, old and new shots of the same place. There is here, in the next one, a photograph of the rear of the City Hall and a view over to the towers of the Frauenkirche. That area there, mind you, this is 1948, by that time, within the first couple of years, had been completely cleaned up. So you think in the modern picture of that same spot, what are the people doing there? Well, what they're doing is fixing up the subway there in anticipation of the great hullabaloo that's going to be going on in Munich for the World Cup. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but it was impossible to get exactly the same photograph. Which makes me pause for a second to say that some of these places we cannot be absolutely sure. A number of them are educated guesses, and I'll mention that as we go along. Others are very evident. The next one is a view, if one would turn around from the previous picture, 180 degrees, and look down toward the Tal, where the famous and infamous Hofbräuhaus is. This is a overhead passageway that also quite beautifully survived in the war. You notice in the old picture the American Jeep. In the new one, a little patching up, but an automobile facing in exactly the same direction. To the Frauenkirche. By this time in 1948, the roof, which had been completely burned out, as well as the entire interior of the church, the roof had been replaced. And you look at it and think, oh, well, that got through the war pretty well. It certainly did not. It was a total devastation. The towers stood, and the walls, mostly. The next picture shows it with the roof now with those tiny dormer-like windows in the roof itself. The next view is actually down at the base of it, looking over toward the principal spire of the new City Hall. There you see it right there. You could hardly believe the next picture is taken from pretty much the same spot because of this vast pile of rubble that's in the foreground. But it's a very attractive place now to sit outdoors. There's several cafes and restaurants sitting around, and it's in the part of the so-called Fußgängerzone, or the part of the city that's been closed to vehicular traffic. A very attractive place. Again, the towers of the Frauenkirche with a crane beginning to lift stuff up for the repair of the, I think in this case, the domes of the two towers. Same place in 2004. Here's a picture, I think we ended with it in the other go-around earlier, of Mickey, my friend Mickey, and Heribert walking along in what we think is, we're not absolutely positive, this is either the Maxburgstrasse or the Landschaftsstrasse, which parallels the northern side of the Frauenkirche. Here's a scene of quite total devastation. To give credit, this first picture I got from the Stadtarchiv, the city archives were very helpful in searching out some of these places. This is a wall of the so-called Maxburg, the Herzog Maxburg, an immense castle, 16th century, that was so entirely destroyed that what was left was pulled away. But I got a picture of this, one of the many entrances into the various courtyards in this next picture. And it was really something, trying to find out where exactly this gateway was. You see, it has a very particular kind of engaged column or pilaster, and that I was given very many poor leads on that, but finally Barbara Sebald at the Stadtarchiv came up with this. The next one shows a very similar gateway, but it's actually on the other side of the Maxburg. It was the only thing of this really huge palace that survived the war. And so they built in its place, and part of its place, this really quite vapid, if not ugly, business building. I think there are a lot of law firms in there, but this one tower has survived, and that's from exactly the same building. At the beginning of the Ludwigstrasse, as one gets into the city core, that huge, impressive, sometimes oppressive, straight Ludwigstrasse put down by Klenze under Ludwig I in the early 19th century. At the end of it is a copy here of the Loggia del Nancy in Florence that I mentioned before. And here it was some sort of gathering. There are lions in there, and they're guarding Bavaria. There is the same place, a little farther back as it is today. Around to one side of it, if you can imagine looking, having just seen this great loggia, is the Residenzstrasse, and there are Justin and Hans walking toward us in the Residenzstrasse, and the same shot today. No question about that. The Theatinerkirche is on the other side of the Feldherrnhalle. That has only very recently been completed in its reconstruction. There it is in 48. The 2004 shot was a bad one. You can't get quite the same thing in because some sort of fair was going on. And they had tents and booths and all sorts of things put all over that area in the Odeonsplatz. In the background of the next one, you can see the Theatinerkirche from a different angle, farther up the Ludwigstrasse, and there's the Feldherrnhalle also in the background, with Hans and myself, so I didn't take this picture, no credit. Justin, and kneeling is Heribert. Now, he's the only person we could get for the 2004 shot. There he is kneeling at the very same, or the replaced, no doubt, replaced Litfaßsäule, or kind of kiosk where events in the city are posted. Heribert and Mickey, she's glowering at something, looking up the Ludwigstrasse. Heribert's holding his mappa, or his little briefcase, and he's holding, in the next picture, his modern briefcase. Mickey, alas, isn't there. She's no longer with us. But this gives you the view of, it doesn't quite give you the full view of how imposing that street is, how ominous also. Next is the Max-Joseph-Platz, the statue of Max Joseph on his throne, and behind it the Residenz, or the principal palace of Munich, then and now. Entirely and beautifully reconstructed. If we shift just a little bit to the right, there's the same place. We don't see the great statue in the middle, but we see in first the ruins of the Nationaltheater, the opera, and as it looks now, resplendent, a house of very beautiful productions. Of this next shot, I cannot be absolutely certain. It's, I believe, the buildings on the Maximilianstrasse to the east of the Nationaltheater. If it's not, let's see the next shot here. It's very, very like it. These are now both shops and offices for the opera. The next is the Armee Museum, the military museum in Munich, in two old shots. One of the wing of it, we can see is not much left of it. And the next picture, the central dome with two very long wings that were devastated, demolished. They were taken away. The thought was to take the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche in Berlin as an example and preserve it as an admonitory structure. No more war. Look what war did to a building. But then, of course, no, it was too precious a piece of property. And here we have what it is now. The central core reconstructed and two glass-topped buildings in which the Neue Staatskanzlei, or the state of Bavaria, the chancellery of that state, is now. Not too beautiful, and it no longer reminds us of war, except that the tomb of the unknown soldier is there. This is a corner nearby, and we saw this before, and I told you that this sign says, "Look out, this is a construction going on here." That's the corner behind what we were just looking at, the Staatskanzlei, and this is what the place looks like now. Obviously, they couldn't keep anything and started from scratch. The next one is the former Café Prinz Regent, and this took forever to find out what this one was. We made a number of misjudgments about it, but Alan said, no, it can't be, and she was absolutely right. It could not be. So we searched around, and with the help of, again, Barbara Sebald at the Stadtarchiv, we came up with a positive identification. It was built as a law office. Then it became the Prince Regent Cafe, one of the very swank cafes in Munich. It's right near the Haus der Kunst, which wasn't hurt at all. You can see in the background just the corner of the Haus der Kunst. I mentioned before, it's very odd. Everything around the Haus der Kunst was demolished, but not the Haus der Kunst. A Hitlerbau. Somebody said, oh, they'll make a great officers' club for the American zone of occupation. That's what it became. And this, you can hardly believe, but a colleague took the picture just where I asked her to stand, and this is what it looks like now. You can't even see the corner of the Haus der Kunst at all. The courtyard of the Residenz has around a couple of edges a great gallery building. This is the end of one of the galleries, and you can see a lot of it was preserved and redone. There are art shops mostly in these galleries. It looks kind of tedious, but it really marvelous place to walk up and down and admire the wildly expensive objects in the windows. We get back to the Ludwigstrasse here. We're looking, and I think perhaps one can see the Siegestor at the far end, but this is the corner of Ludwigstrasse, the Odeonsplatz, and where the Briennerstrasse turns in. And there are Bill and Heinz Münzinger, leader of the German contingent, and Gustl Weber, our leader. Have no idea who these people on their bicycles are who are standing exactly at the same place. Go up the Briennerstrasse and stop at the first spot. You come to what was the PX, the American PX. There's Heribert, there's a lad putting his foot on the back of I don't know what kind of a car that is, and somebody peeking out of it. And this is the same spot today. Looks like Heribert is trying to put his foot up on a car that's not there, but that's what it looks like today. You can compare the old automobile with, I think, a fairly fancy Mercedes Cabriolet. Turning 180 degrees around from that spot with your back to the PX, you can see the Wittelsbachplatz. In the background, the Palais Ludwig Ferdinand, and in the foreground, the equestrian statue of the Kurfürst, or the Prince-Elector Maximilian I. We were going off in a train somewhere. Look at the train then and look at the station now. A bit of a difference there. This next one we are very vague about. We think that this is where the Deutsche Postverwaltung was. In any case, a mess. 2 shots of it. And if we're right, and I think we're right, this is the Deutsche Postverwaltung as it is now. The Königsplatz, Ludwig I built that with the Propylaeon directly ahead, and on either side, the Glyptothek on the right, we don't see it at all. The first public museum in Germany, and on the other side, what is now the Staatliche Antikensammlung, glorious classical structures. When I went back the last time, I couldn't take a photograph because it was all hung with black crepe. And we thought, my God, who died? It wasn't anybody who died. It was the entertainer named Sting who had been giving a concert there, so I had to come back later and take a picture of the Propylaeon as it looks now. All right, before we go to the university, one quick return to Hohenschwangau. Remember where I was for a couple of weeks with Hermann and his mother. Here is a shot first out of my window looking toward Austria. I had a little tiny room in the attic where a bird flew in once, and I remember had a hell of a time getting him out of there. And this Hermann took. He went back up and got permission from the forester who lives in that apartment right now to lean out his window and take the shot with the roof overhang in exactly the same place. Excellent work by Hermann. We go north to the area around the university and to the dormitory where we were working and which was really the principal reason for this whole production. On the Türkenstrasse, I'm pretty sure that's where this picture was taken, a typical burned out ruin. And what's there now? Internet and phone shop. And everything on the doorway is basically in techno-English. That's German now today. 2 fountains on either side of the Ludwigstrasse, one in front of the university and one across the way near the Veterinärstrasse. A group of us, in fact the same group taken along. This is another professional shot. The next one is my shot of Hermann standing exactly where he was standing with the renewed main building of the university in the background. Turning north to the right from that spot, we see the Siegestor, the Victory Arch, as it was in 1948, and as it still is now, basically uncompleted. It is not restored. This is the monument to the war. We've seen that one before. Down to the left of that, to the west, is the enormous Akademie der Bildenden Künste, the Art Academy of the university. As it was, not dreadfully wrecked, not so much as the university itself, and as good a picture as I could take in 2004. The trees in the cars make it impossible to take an adequate shot. There, standing in front of the same place, is Hans, We've seen him before with his bouquet and his Time magazine, and look what we found. The same spot today without Hans. Notice, however, the enormous rebuilding. That area was in particular taken out. We skip a little ahead because these next shots are after our work at the Maria Antonia dormitory and in front of where we moved into to work on the film. You'll remember that. There are Hans and Bill flanking someone we haven't mentioned before. This is the Gräfin, or the Countess Dietland von Kleist, a great friend and marvelous person. And the same spot, I don't think the same Lombardy poplar trees, unless they grow very, very slowly, but they've certainly been replaced, of people walking away from the camera. The person walking away closest to us is, as you know, Heribert. Now here is where we lived. I think you've seen this shot before, where the pension was, and we say we've got to be very, very careful about what door to walk out of when we lived there. It has been rebuilt, and it is a reinsurance company now. This is Leopoldstrasse. The name changes after you go north and through the Siegestor. There is the Siegestor. We're looking south there, being picked up by the Geiselgasteig limousine to take us to make the film, and there is Heribert standing in the same place. Car is quite different. Now to the work spot. Heinz Münzinger stands on the top of what was left of the dormitory, and the background, a building that's no longer there, and a picture of Hans and Bill at the same spot. And this is what we have definitely determined that corner now looks like. View down into the workplace, and if we could go over the edge of it and look down, the next is what we'd be seeing today. Most of those buildings entirely new. Another shot lower down of that same corner of that building that no longer exists. We're building the first floor of the dormitory. And that space between the corner of the old building and the two empty windows is the same space as it is now between these two buildings. Not inspiring architecture, but very comfortably, beautifully built what they're doing, what they've done in Germany now, and the interiors are marvelous. I'd love to have an apartment there. What did the Maria Antonia house look like before the war? This is what it looked like before the war. The next one shows what it looked like after a number of bombing raids up and down everywhere. And finally, a remarkable reconstruction. This is what it looks like today. The corner of it, where you go in for the main entrance, had in 1948 this appearance. It says Marie Antonia House. It's a dormitory, and still a dormitory, but it's now a co-ed dormitory, and it has rooms, adequate rooms, for about little under 100 students. There's the same corner with the same inscription, but not in mosaic. Hermann stands above, looking down into the Kaulbachstrasse, and if you see this little niche above the main door with the bullseye window, and go up, and between that is a niche, and that was our point of focus, both that niche, the windows, and particularly this ocular, this round window. So that was saved. We ate in the basement of the Maria Antonia house. That was refurbished. In fact, people lived down there. There we are, having a meal, and that's what the place looks like now. Not very edifying. It seems to me that it's a bar or something. A little jolly evening with Schifferklavier or an accordion, and one of the students all dressed up in a Bavarian Tracht, and the same place today with a ping pong table. Do you see in this one, this is the wall, the lintel has not been put on it yet, but over Roger's head is the round window. And here is what that window is now. It looks out onto the same round window. That building across the way was just about the only one that was really preserved, whereas the one, our place right across the street, was removed. Here is the same spot. The lintel is now in place, and there are Bill and Hans's father, Georg. I walk upstairs, having arrived at the dormitory, being shown the whole tour by Hans. Same stairway, refurbished. There I am, and there's Herbert trying to look like Hans. A shot across the street from the top shows the chimneys, partly rebuilt. We talked about that before. They had to be for the heat that was needed. This is that building now. To all intents and purposes, one chimney showing now, but there are others on the other side. Nice bit of reconstruction. And finally, before we go up and down the Isar, finally, here, if we would stand on the top, as far up as we could get, and look to the left, up the Kaulbachstrasse to the north, this is the appalling rubble heap that was there. On the other side of this is the Englischer Garten, the great garden, laid down by Count Rumford for Ludwig I, and the same area now. We chose it because of the foliage, so to speak, the weeds in the tree. And you'll have to imagine going up to that tree and turning slightly to the left and looking across that. All this has been built up now. If we go into the English garden and walk to the southeast, you will come to a rather famous object in the English garden. It's called the Monopterus, the one-eye thing. There it is in 48 and basically unchanged in 2004. Walk, a considerable walk, to the Prinzregentenstrasse, which will mean something to those of you who know Munich. And at the end of that, across the Isar, is the so-called Friedensengel, or the Angel of Peace, a rather elaborate event celebrating the end of the Prinzregentenstrasse. At the time, however, up behind it in the so-called Mühlstrasse was the headquarters of the black market. And here it is now with a bit of the balustrade of the bridge that crosses the Isar. You'll notice no water in the first picture, but that the fountain is playing in the next one. Stand there in front of the Friedensengel, do a 180-degree turn, and you're looking up the Prinzregentenstrasse in 1948, and with a lot of water coming out of the fountain in 2004. Walk down to the Isar, go upstream, that is to the south, of course, the Isar River, which flows right through Munich, comes from the south, comes from the Alps, a wonderful clean river, cold as the devil. There are some people bathing at a bridge, underneath a bridge in 1948, and the same spot, of course, all the shoals and sands and sandbars and everything have shifted, but that's the way it looks now. Same bridge, wasn't hit. Underneath the bridge, closer up, we sit on not exactly sand, more like pebbles, and there's Herbert, myself, and Hans with something in his mouth, probably a pebble. And the same, more or less the same area, but I didn't get the arch of the bridge in that. A bit of it perhaps is suggested, with the people still sunbathing, still the same place. Go up the bridge, up to the bridge, cross it to the right, as it were, and look back to Munich, and there is the biggest evangelical or Lutheran church in the city, the Lukaskirche, St. Luke's Church. Wasn't badly hit from what you see. The back of it was. Here we are on the bridge looking back at that other bridge, the same group, represented in 2004 by Heribert. Farther along the way, there's a little park with a statue of not the Isar River, but it's called Vater Rhein. For some reason, the Rhine River is being celebrated there, with a nice statue and a pleasant place to sit in the sun and take some tea. Then and now. Finally, we arrive at the corner of the Steinsdorfer Straße and the Zweibrückenstraße, which crosses over to the Deutsches Museum. There was at one time there, and here it is in an old, late 19th century photograph provided by the Stadtarchiv. It was called the Café Neptune, and was the place for the swanked to gather and take their tea then. It was badly, badly hit and was torn down. There it is, 48, and that's what replaces it now. There's a Chinese restaurant on the lower floor at that corner. We have been looking at a few glimpses of what I call my Munich in 1948 snapshots and in revisits to the same locales in 2004. Ruins, reconstructions, replacements. Some places looking remarkably unchanged, some others entirely different. The Munich ramble that I took last year with Heribert, and later partly on my own, fortified my conviction and realization that I am not so interested at this stage in my life in seeing new things as I am in seeing how the same things have changed over the years. T.S. Eliot said that old men should be explorers, and over in his work he asserts that revisits are also valid and essential explorations. How often we say that one should never look back. I don't agree with that, and I think neither did Eliot. It's a fatuous remark, with, however, one essential proviso, namely that one has had a satisfactory life. Without it, I certainly must agree that it should only be onward and upward. But I confess that I am one of those who has had a lucky life and likes looking back on it. My approach to these pictures is hardly novel. Then and now books and exhibitions are legion. Among the dozens that I've seen over the years, I'm thinking now of a book of old engravings by Piranesi of Rome and of modern photographs of what is there now. A few weeks ago, I visited an exhibition in New York of 1930s photographs made by Berenice Abbott, mostly of downtown Manhattan, and the same places seen today in splendid dead-on shots made in recent years by Douglas LeVere. It's called New York Changing, and it's a masterpiece of fidelity and obsession. It makes one a little envious, a little. I tried here to be equally slavish, but lacked the talent to do so with my little point-and-shoot camera. Without the technical expertise and inventiveness of Alan Wilkinson, this mission surely could not have been accomplished. We began the final segment of the walkabout with a picture of the unexceptional St. Martin's Church, not far upstream on the Isar River from where we ended with the former Neptune Cafe and its homely replacement, a quite unpretentious Chinese restaurant. That was the last shot, you'll recall. That restaurant could be just about anywhere, and that's my point. I purposely end on this 1960s, 1970s vernacular note. It's not a pretty building, but in these terms, it works as a metaphor and as a symbol. The fact of what happened to the Café Neptune reassured me about Munich and about Germany today. It made me comfortable. I entered the restaurant as I was poking around, trying to get the right angle to shoot it, and I asked the proprietor, a man from China who spoke excellent German, by the way, I asked him if he knew anything about the history of his corner, where his restaurant is now. Did he know anything about the Café Neptune? Ever heard of it? No, nothing. He was far too busy with customers and with his waiters to be engaged with my peculiar question. He asked me only, "Table for one?" And I said, yes. I hadn't intended to eat there, but I did. At the outset of all of this, I asserted that this excursion would be neither a romp through history with scattershots of blame and recrimination, nor that it would be an autobiography. My apologies, that was not the truth. Everything is history. Everything is politics. And everything is autobiography. So, what can other people do? Principally, my American compatriots, to learn from enterprises like this, from my effort to catch up with what once was. In this case, my engagement with things German, and where that took me in life. I am not at all sure what others may learn, but I do know that Germany, by and large, has learned in an exemplary way to come to terms with its 20th century past and not to bury it. More so, I believe, than any other country I know. And it had the farthest to go. Germany has become European. Germany has become international. Germany has become a decent place. Can we hope that more, if not all, countries will become decent places, at least for a good part of the future? A recent issue of Stern, the popular illustrated magazine in Germany, has on its cover and as its lead article this: 60 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, the crime of a millennium, and the question, must we still feel guilty today? That question is rhetorical. The attached editorial in Stern concludes, we have left chauvinism, militarism, and imperialism behind us. We have become a civil society. If the memory of Auschwitz is to have any meaning at all, then it can be only to guard and preserve us from a relapse into barbarism and totalitarianism. It is good that we now have in Berlin this new enormous memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. The victims don't need it. We need it. And another related quotation from the October, just came in, 6th edition of New York Review of Books. Tony Judd writes, as the German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder reminded his German audience on the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the memory of the war, this is what Schröder said, the memory of the war and the genocide are part of our life. Nothing will change that. These memories are part of our identity. That says something important for us all, but it doesn't say everything. Nothing can, of course. It does not say that history should stop here in some kind of fictional utopia. We know that in the 19th and early 20th century, as heirs to the Enlightenment, Germany's proud, aggressive, expansionist Wilhelminianism brought to Europe a mere quarter century later only 12 years of a 1,000-year Reich and an obliterating war with millions upon millions of dead. And we know now that it rebuilt itself and that much of its soul has survived. So what now for us 60 years later? Must we, should we, share in a tragic sense of history? Or should our hope reside in what that inconsequential Chinese restaurant in Munich exemplifies? One of countless ethnic establishments everywhere in diverse and promisingly polyglot Germany, with its welter of tongues and its young, perhaps resurgent, inhabitants. Can we manage to connect? Only connect as wise E.M. Forster exhorted us? Or, despite all efforts to connect, do we nevertheless share in the conviction of the equally wise and great diplomat scholar, the late George Kennan? Speaking expressly of the United States in this appropriate case, Kennan calls it our tragic country. Where are we among nations headed? We say that history repeats itself. But how? When and where?